Okay, this morning we begin back on page 40 of our notes on the exegetical process, the exegetical method that we employ. We left off on interrogating the text, page 40. And if you remember page 40, you can imitate what commentaries do. Commentaries are constantly interrogating the text. As it says here is, you need to ask questions that will elicit informational areas to determine key people, places, events, the ideas of the book, and there they are. I have 6 faithful serving men who taught me all I know. Their names are what, where, when, how, why, and who. These are the essential questions that you interrogate the text in the exegetical process to elicit information. You're asking these questions of the text. You're trying to find out these type of questions and in the process discover problems. Remember the last time. You're looking for lexical problems, who, what, when, where, why, how. You're looking for grammatical problems, syntactical problems. And you're asking these questions constantly of the text in order to elicit enough information to determine these answers. On the top of page, and by the way, you should put not only are who, what, when, where, why, and how on page 40, but please put there, see also page 171. There again, our exegetical notes talk about how to ask questions of the text on page 171. If you turn there for a second, on page 171, it talks about meditating on the passage. Meditate. Ask questions. Ask interpretive questions, page 170. 170, H2, definitive. What does this mean? Why this term? Why not another term? Rational. Why is this said this way? Implicational. What does this imply? Identificational. Who or what is involved? Temporal. When is this accomplished? Modal. How? Local. Where? These are the type of questions, but remember, and I want to put this on the board because this is so important. There is a balance in answering these questions. Some exegetes will talk about precision. Some exegetes will just talk about, well, it's the general idea of the passage. That's all we can do. I believe these are two extremes. I think the better term when you look at a passage is to be accurate. Now, what do I mean by that? Even when you ask these questions of the text as you're meditating, you can't always answer every detail. You can't cross every T, dot every I. If you try to say precision in answering these questions, this may cause you to make that passage say more than it should say. You have to constantly ask yourself the question, am I making that passage say more than it does? The other extreme is, Am I ignoring that passage so that I'm imposing my theology and making it say not what it says, but less maybe than what it says? The key is to be accurate. That means you don't press a passage beyond what it actually is saying. Precision means you get into so little details that you make that verse say much more than it does. This other idea over here is it make much less. Keep it accurate. That means you may not be able to answer all the questions that you interrogate with. It's okay. It's as bad to make the Bible say more than it does as it is to say, make it disrespect it so it doesn't say what it says. This especially happens in theology. You interrogate the text doesn't agree with your theology, and then you ignore it. This is a typical one. God is not willing that any should perish. Oh, sorry, got to impose my theology there. That's any of the elect. Doesn't say that. Do not impose your theology on the text. Let the text speak for itself. Precision makes you go far into details that may or may not be addressed by that passage. You are to be faithful to the text at that point. So you want to keep that balance in answering these questions. Questions. Top of page 41. As we've told you, the process of validation. Repetition is what? Key learning is what? That's why you'll hear, well, I think you've said this. Well, I'm going to say it again and again and again. As you interrogate the text, each paragraph you come to, that paragraph could be one that you've designed or the UBS, you give it a preliminary title. Preliminary. What is it essentially saying? Each paragraph. Why? Keeps you from taking that portion of Scripture out of context. You're constantly asking yourself, what is the essential meaning of this paragraph here? What is the writer trying to say? Big picture. Listen to me, in exegesis, you have to keep not only the worm's eye view, but the bird's eye view. Remember this? You've got to keep the big picture. That's what a map is. It gives you the big picture. You've got to keep the details as well as the big picture. So you're giving each paragraph an essential statement of what it's about, big picture. And here are the quality and characteristics of that big picture. That preliminary paragraph that will eventually become permanent for you, but always keep your options open to be able to modify it in the future, should be brief. See that word brevity? Do you see it? It should be suggestive. It'll help you recall the substance of the paragraph. It should be suitable. And it should be unique. But listen to me now. Careful. You need to be faithful to the text. That means this. I never get into this onomatopoetic rhyming. I never get into this, the cause, the circumstances, the creation. It sounds poetically good, doesn't it? And oftentimes your desire to be poetic or to have everything begin with the same letter for memory purposes doesn't work. You so override the meaning of the passage to make your beautiful poetry for remembrance that you become unfaithful to the passage. Don't do that. So you're asking those. You're making those interrogations to come up with that brief preliminary controlling purpose statement. And then remember, once you get the preliminary controlling purpose statement, you have to go into the details of that section and ask, what are at least two supporting points underneath, and you're constantly using validation. Do my supporting points match my purpose statement? Does my purpose statement coordinate with my supporting points? Constantly asking that. You're keeping this in your head. Many of you will be a busy pastor. Some of you will not be able to write this down as well. One thing nice, though, if you write it down, you go to another church, you just pull out your notes from that time. But some of you may not have it. Keep it in your head about these preliminary controlling purpose statements, supporting points, and then keep that coordination going. Every time you're doing that in the major divisions of the book. And sometimes you may want to make your own divisions of the book. Just because someone's made a paragraph somewhere in the UBS or in the New American Standard does not mean that you have to agree with it. On page 42, our notes give us clues by which parts of the book may be discovered on your own. Direct statements. Watch for direct statements. Paul will say in 1 Corinthians, now concerning spiritual gifts, or I hear from such and such. These are obvious clues of division. Watch for those. Pay attention. Sometimes you'll have the Greek repeated over and over again. Again, 1 Corinthians, peride, peride. Now concerning, now concerning, now concerning. There's the division. Watch for these. Watch for a possible change in the genre from prose to poetry. Sometimes that's hard to determine. Sometimes the writer will change or repeat certain grammatical forms. There will be an abrupt change in person, tense, mood, or voice. And sometimes there will be an obvious change in subject matter. Watch for these. These help show you where the natural divisions are in the book. And may I say on the bottom of page 42 that the key to all of this is careful observation. Listen to me, this will not happen overnight. Some of you guys that can sit down 10 minutes before the sermon and do all of this, it's extreme rarity. It takes meditation. Frankly, you may want to get one of those little iPods. Get a spoken translation and listen while you're jogging. And as the book of the Bible that you're preaching through is spoken, find pleasant narrator, good translation. You'd be surprised what can come to you just by listening. This isn't going to come overnight. You need careful observation. That's why choose a book that really, this sounds subjective, but really is something that just, Lord, help me choose a book that just strikes at me spiritually. And then start listening to it. Get one of those little iPads. Take a walk. You'd be surprised at the different ways you can do this. But you can't do it, in my opinion. Most people can't do it. We'll put it that way. There's always an exception, such as Doc over there, who is a genius. Someone that would come up with the observations, the questions, the paragraph distributions, the purpose statements and supporting points. And this has to be done over time. This has to be done meditatingly. And I don't mean you go off into a corner and start humming or something, or chanting. It's just that it takes time. To me, one of the most pleasant ways to do it would be just to listen. You ever get one of those? They're $49, those little nanos or whatever. You take somebody What do you guys think? The best spoken MP3 of maybe the New Testament or the Old Testament. Anybody have any preferences?
Yeah, they've got them for free.
Bible.is.
ESV Dramatic.
ESV Dramatic. What else?
Max McLean.
Yeah.
Huh?
Max McLean does a decent job.
Max McLean. Any others?
The Bible Experience. It's all African American actors and songwriters.
Really?
It's a different take.
It's true. But what you ought to do, though, for exegesis, which is okay, is to make sure you get a translation that would be faithful to the original. I mean, you know, I guess they don't have Greek people speaking Greek. They just have the English translations, right? This is very helpful. Anybody else like a spoken MP3 Bible where the guy reads it? I used to listen when I was in college sometimes to Family Life used to do a family Bible reading. It was really good. The guy had a nice voice and you could listen. And it's funny how visually you learn things, auditorially you will learn things, and you're just meditating and let your mind, your subconscious work on it. You'd be surprised all of a sudden, why didn't I see that before? Any others? Tronway?
I was actually just going to ask you, what translation do you prefer, whether studying or listening?
Well, I'm a lost cause on that. I still prefer, but it's lost huge market share due to a lot of problems. It's still one that I like, and that's the New American Standard. It's a lost cause, though, for me because it's the market share due to some things is way down. But I hope it's not because I'm used to it. I thought the New King James did okay. Those two are formal, literal translations. And since I've worked with the New American Standard so much, I can kind of tell the Greek constructions behind what they're doing. You know, it's kind of like, but that doesn't mean one translation doesn't fit all sizes. I don't want you to think you have to be so inflexible. It's just that I tend to like that one, but good luck. It's down to 1 or 2% market share of all the Bibles. NIV is clearly taken over in ESV, but I still think the New American Standard was a very carefully one. Revised Standard Version is excellent too. And the New Revised Standard Version, I know that there are problems with all of them, but if you can get an audible Bible and just listen. Another way to do it that somebody told me in college, and I think that it's an idea that's good, is if you, let's say you're preaching through Ephesians. If you read Ephesians once a day for 30 days, how long would it take you to really just read Ephesians? It's what, 6 chapters in English? I'm not talking about the Greek. I don't think that would take you too long. You could become an expert. Or just maybe 1 chapter a day. How many chapters in Ephesians? 6. So 1 chapter a day, you could read it like 4. That helps build that understanding of the book. These are the kind of things. And you're constantly asking these questions. Who, what, when, where. You're interrogating the text. You're thinking, what is that paragraph about? What is that paragraph essentially saying? What are the Paul's supporting points? This is what I learned. How many times Christians take able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we can ask or think out of context, and it's like God is a magic genie, just rub the magic lamp. Well, what he's talking about is, in that passage, Gentile inclusion. Here is a Jewish man that hated Gentiles, thought that salvation was only for Jews, that Gentiles were fodder for hell. God saved him. He became a man filled with grace and compassion toward Gentiles, goyim. And that is actually spoken of in terms of the fact that back, Gentiles were chosen in him before the foundation of the world. We didn't see this as Jews. This is wonderful. God can do above what we could ask or think. He's going to save more than just Jewish people. And so that you begin to see as you're reading through the connections of things. So you're constantly doing this. You read, you listen, those kind of things. And you'd be surprised what you can come up with. The goal of this is to wean yourself off of commentaries. Commentaries are helps, just like a concordance, just like an English translation. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong to consult a commentary, but I am saying that if you do exegesis like we're saying, you won't have to slavishly depend upon digesting commentaries. Questions? I thought I saw a hand. Okay, let's move on then. So you're looking for those structural clues, the major divisions in the book. On page 44, you're looking for those controlling purpose statements for the book. You're looking for the big idea on page 44, and he gives 4 of them, and they're good. What is the outstanding or leading idea in that paragraph? What is the basic assertion being made? What is the writer's goal here? Develop that preliminary purpose statement and then the supporting points for that preliminary purpose statement. And that's what your goal is to do. In all of this, on page 46, you are gaining familiarity with the book. You've already gained some familiarity with the book by doing a historical background paper. You're taking that information, and when you read through the book, you're taking that information and it's eliciting more understanding of the book. Look at page 47. A caution must be given regarding the common temptation. You see that there? 47, number C. A caution must be given. Are you listening? To avoid all independent historical research and allow a commentator to do it for the student. You've got to think for yourself. Notice what he says, and this is so true. The touch of authenticity in both teaching and preaching comes from your own personal interaction with the material. How will people take you as an authentic preacher? You're not canned. Have you ever heard a preacher and you say, whoa, that sounds awful canned? You know what canned means? It sounds trite, like he's getting it all from the same commentary you read. I don't like canned preaching. I don't like canned delivery. I don't know what they teach you in homiletics, but you've got to buy it. You've got to buy into your preaching. Do you know that? You got to believe what you're preaching. If you just spout what you've learned, people can detect whether you truly believe what you're preaching or you're spouting facts that you've learned from a book. Did you know that? Did you know that? I can't hear you. Yes or no? Yes. Or are you just agreeing with me? People will know if you ever heard a canned sermon where it just stereotypical sermon sounds like he read it and then now has memorized it? You don't want canned sermons. You want to be, to use a 70s term because I'm a 70s guy, you got to be real. How dare you mock me in my old age? You got to be real. You got to believe it. There's a fire in you that's got to be. Because people will catch that. Listen to me. 90 7%. I was debating between 97 and 98, but it's 97. Why are you laughing at me? You're mocking me. Somebody give me a handkerchief. I'm going to start crying. 97% of all communication is nonverbal. Did you know that? People can detect from you a lot of things. They'll know whether you're given a canned sermon, whether you've memorized it, whether it sounds like a commercial. You got to really, really emotionally believe what you're preaching. So you avoid being a canned preacher. And you have to research. Gain knowledge of that book. On page 48, you're investigating the author. Who were the readers? What were the circumstances? When did the writer write this? Where were they located? You did this in your historical background paper. So you've done a historical background paper. Now you're an expert, right? Listen to me preaching. When you first preach through a book, that doesn't make you an expert. One time through, no. It's that you preach the book over and over again. You're constantly learning and open. You haven't arrived. That your understanding of God's Word is better today than it was yesterday, and better yesterday than it was the day before yesterday, etc., etc., etc. You're constantly learning. You're not satisfied with doing one paper, and now you're an expert. I'm not an expert on Ephesians. I've got a long way to go. So you're looking at that. You're looking at the background. You're learning. And what did you use for your background paper that you did? What did you use? You used commentaries. You should have used New Testament introductions, periodical literature, Bible dictionaries. You could find a good monograph on the book. Remember now, you're finding 2 or 3 essential commentaries, but you also want to build and enrich your library with New Testament introductions, Bible dictionaries, monographs, specialized works that will help you so that that book actually becomes a part of your thinking as you interrogate the text and as you ask those questions. Our exegetical method actually wants you to go through, and you could do this, identify author, put an A, readers, circumstances with a C, these kind of things. You could do that. But you've got to take these ideas and make it your own. You're constantly listening to the text over and over again. You're reading it over and over again. You're thinking about it. This kind of mental work, if done correctly, should really tire your brain. Do you know that you can tire your brain? By the way, you know that the brain is somewhat like a muscle? Did you know that? The doc's laughing at me. Notice the look on his face, like, here we go again with this crazy medical advice. But listen, they're discovering brain plasticity, which the doc says is a technical term. Well, It means this: use it or... I have a congregation where there are some older people. They love the old songs. Why? As you get older, your brain loses the ability to adapt, to do new things. You become grooved in your mind. It happens. It's natural. It's the law of thermodynamics, whatever you want, second law of thermodynamics. But that's why people need to constantly be challenging both left and right hemispheres of their brain to be doing things, because over time, your brain loses the ability to adapt. They love the old song, so when they try to sing a new song, they don't like it. Why? It's harder. Your brains become atrophied. Be thankful that you are young. As you get older, your brain loses flexibility. It loses the ability to adapt. It wants familiarity. It's called brain plasticity. Science is now realizing you should, to keep your brain active, to keep you from developing certain symptoms, presenting symptoms of what older people do present, you need to keep adapting, keep experiencing things. Use your left hand if you're right-handed. Use your right hand if you're left-handed. These are the things that you need to do constantly. They have puzzles and little math things that they have that you can buy in a Sony Play thing, the portable PlayStation, where you can keep your mind going, because that exercise, mental exercise, keeps you sharp. You know what happens when most people retire, or many people retire? They go downhill. They like the narrow little familiarity, and that actually atrophies your brain. That's why I never want to come to a time in which I can't handle technology. Windows 8 is coming out. The new Mac system, lion, leopard, what's next? They're going to have to figure out some other animal. How about Mac Raptor? Or something. Let's get into some dinosaurs or stuff. I want to learn those new systems. I love to keep your brain going. I don't want to get to a point where you go, I don't want to do that anymore, all that. I don't want to sing that song because it's too hard to learn. So you're constantly interrogating the text, keeping your brain active. You're never satisfied with preaching that controlling purpose statement. You're always looking for something that may be better and more accurate. On page 63, look at how he's charted out and visualized the argument. There's a couple ways to learn. You can learn by, the Greeks would say anaginosko, to read up. Well, you can learn by memorizing, but another way to learn is visualize it. Write it out. Graph it out. Some of you may learn well that way. I do. My math teacher taught me to visualize the math problem. It was great once I learned. Write it out. Look what he's done on page 63. He's written it out, the big picture. He's found doctrinal, polemical, practical, all in that book, and graphed it out in a picture. Look, learning isn't only abstract. We learn by visualizing our learning. Draw a picture. See how the parts relate to the whole. Draw that picture. Graph it out. Don't be ashamed to draw and graph it out. It'll help you learn through visualizing it. And he sets forth on page 63 the divisions of the book. Paul prays, Paul teaches, Paul warns, Paul exhorts. This is building a picture for you so that when you get to it and you preach it, you see it. Write it out. Now, this doesn't mean that you're going to hand it in to somebody. But I'll tell you something. Nothing I like better than to pull a old sermon out, maybe a folder, and remember some of the thoughts I wrote down, the pictures I might have drawn, and it brings back to my remembrance, especially when you're candidating maybe for a church and you've got this done. Man, this can help. So draw it out in a visual manner, the divisions, as well as mere writing something. Draw it out. Graph it. Picture it. To make sure that you're gaining that familiarity, you're asking those questions. That's just the preliminary. Now look what we get on page 65, gentlemen. Now you get into the intensive study. You say, wait a second there. I thought we were. Well, that was all preliminary. The background, the preliminary purpose statement, all that. Now you do the intensive study. What? I thought that was intensive. No. Now you start getting into the Greek of those paragraphs even more intensely. Familiarity of the Greek text should not breed what? This is where you start observing word order. Tense. Remember how we did this in our review in last semester? Why does the writer use this tense? Why this verb? Could he have used another verb? Does he use two verbs together that are synonyms? Does he contrast with antonyms? Look at page 65. When you get into this intensive study, starting on page 64 and now page 65, look what you're asking. You're looking for what on page 65? Begins with a P. Mark says problems. You're right. And if you don't find plenty of problems for your paper, guess what? You have a problem. You can just take Honer's commentary and see how many problems he discovered. Rod?
Last week I asked you about finding problems and syntactical issues within narratives, and you asked me to mention it.
Yes. Rod brought up something very interesting. Finding problems will also, the kind of problems you'll find will vary from genre to genre. Let me give you an instance. The epistles are didactic literature. Revelation is didactic literature. The epistles are especially parenetical literature. But the Gospels are more historical narrative. So in historical narrative, you may find different problems, interpretive problems, rather than, per se, as much exegetical problems. Because the Gospels are historical, they tend to have different problems than you'd find in teaching like the epistles. You'll have more detailed problems in the epistles, and with the historical narrative, you'll find different problems. How does this parable as a whole relate to what Jesus is teaching? You won't have as many micro problems as you would in the epistles. See what I'm saying? So that will vary from genre to genre as to the type of problems you'll find. In the historical literature, you won't have the depth of critical doctrinal teaching per se. You have a lot of historical narration of what Jesus did and what Jesus taught. There will be problems, but maybe the different type of problems. But you're asking yourself, you're looking for textual problems, such as Romans 5:1. Did you know there's a textual problem in Romans 5:1? Somebody read Romans 5:1 for me. You're preaching through Romans. You come to Romans 5:1. Who's got it?
Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ.
All right, therefore, having been justified, aorist passive participle, it says we have peace. Did you know that that indicative isn't the best reading there? The subjunctive is the best reading. Let us have peace. Hortatory subjunctive. Well, put that into your theology. The indicative, we have peace, may be not as textually evidential as we should have peace. You've got to become aware of textual problems. You've got to solve that. Well, I know what I want. I want indicative. It meets my theology better. There's a problem. You're looking for those.
You're saying the irene is subjunctive?
No, irene would be a noun. The nouns aren't subjunctive. It's echo. Here, it's this. There are two readings, ekomen and ekomen. Here are the two readings. With this being the most supported by the best manuscripts. This will give you warm fuzzies. We have peace, indicative. Certainty. Every head bowed and every eye closed. No. But let us have peace is exhorting you to have peace with God in light of being justified. This is the better reading. But what does the UBS give you? They like the indicative. Why? It's an easier reading. It's a theology that we like better. You have to solve those problems. Now remember, up to now we've talked about everything was preliminary. So there's this preliminary observation step, everything we've talked up to now. Now you're getting into the real depth. Now you got to solve that. So there's this preliminary phase up to page 63. And then from 63 on, you're getting into the real nitty-gritty of everything. So you look at textual problems. You look at structural problems. You know what would be involved in structural problems? Even punctuation in Greek. Even punctuation in Greek is interpretive. Do you know that the Greek New Testament, when it was originally written, they wrote all in capital letters, all words together, no spaces. Did you know that? That means that the UBS gives you punctuation, and that punctuation is interpreted. That's why I go back to that one. Is it, He chose us in Him to be holy and blameless in love? Or is it in love He predestined us? All depends on where you put the punctuation between 4 and 5. You got to solve that now. You've been meditating on it in the first part. First part is big picture. Now you're getting into the heavy details from page 63 on of your your exegetical notes. You've got to solve that. Punctuation is interpretive. And by the way, can I give you something else? We do appreciate that in church history, the loving labor of people that put chapters and verses into the Bible, the New Testament, the Old Testament. But one of the greatest barriers to proper interpretation is once there's a chapter division, nobody pays attention to what went on before. You ought to take and shove all chapters back up to the previous section so that you can understand. We sometimes disjoin this chapter from this chapter because this is chapter 1, this is chapter 2. And that does a great disservice because the writer hasn't disjoined his thinking at that point. But we sometimes do. And information in the previous context can help us understand that new chapter division. But we just divorce it and say, nothing up above helps me with that new chapter. Just because there's a new chapter doesn't mean that the writer has changed the subject at all. Shove that chapter back up into the previous chapter to make sure you understand the writer's flow of thought. Question? Shove that chapter up and make sure. Watch for conjunctions, inferential conjunctions, adversative conjunctions, explanatory conjunctions that may unite the previous section with that in some way. Do not separate chapters from each other as if they do not belong with each other. Put them back together. Do not observe the chapter divisions like that. You may miss things. Then there's grammatical problems. Grammar. Grammar. You've got to take what you learned in your last semester grammar and solve. What kind of structure is this? How is this structure being used? Is it purpose? Is it result? Is it modal, matter, means? Remember that? Kind of a circumstantial participle is this? What kind of a conditional clause is this? How does that relate to the overall argument? Lexical problems. Why is this word used? In Galatians, Paul said, if you preach a gospel different from what should be preached, let them be damned. Whew. Paul contrasts allos and heteros, placing them in juxtaposition. You need to watch for those. Theological problems will constantly come up, but you do not impose your theology on the text. You let the text correct your theology. Exegetical problems. Very close to grammatical problems. While grammatical problems look for cases, parsings, exegetical relate to the author's meaning of one part to another. And you have to solve those problems on pages 66, 67. How do those problems get solved? Again, you are asking on page 87, How is this participle being used? How is this infinitive being used? Remember how we observed the text. Look at the word order. First attributive position, second attributive position, yes? You're constantly asking, how does that contribute to the meaning that the author is conveying? You're looking at, in page 87 and following, is a beautiful written explanation of what you're looking for. You're looking for how the participles are being used. Can you remember how participles? Means, manner, temporal, causal, conditional. How are they being used? How is the article being used? Sharp's rule, Colwell's rule. How is this a numero uno article? Is this a deictic article? How is this being used? Remember that? This is the intensive study. The preliminary study we had been talking about up to approximately page 63. You just have been meditating. Now you're really focusing in this second stage. Why is this case used and not another case? Why this adverb? Why is it placed? The word order on page 88. Word order. And by the way, let us take an exercise in word order. Let's have some fun. Well, it won't be fun for you, but nonetheless, it is interesting. Everybody turn to 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy. It says the qualification of an elder. Whoop! I apologize. I thought that was wrong. All right, let's take a look at this. Now, let's talk about word order for a second. Let's have some fun. Normally, in Greek, qualifying phrases, words, follow the term. So here's the term one, and then qualifying phrases usually follow. That's normal. Now, it depends upon the author's style, but this is big picture generally true. So we have a qualifying, this qualifies the term, and it usually follows, okay? When it's placed forward, when the qualifying term is placed forward, it's placed forward for emphasis. Now look at this. Andra means what? Close. Husband. I guess you could say man. Now this literally says, husband, one wife. But look what Paul has done. Look what Paul has done. He's taken and put man last in this clause, and he's brought forth two qualifying phrases. One wife, husband. This is doubly emphatic. One wife, man. Look at this. Bishop has to be a one wife, man. So Paul is being emphatic, isn't he? He's putting not just He's putting one even, this is even more, in fact, this is way up front, then this, then that. One wife, man. One. Do you think that they think they can outshout the mega boombox voice that I have? Even when I'm sick, they would have a hard time doing that. Now, what does this mean? Now here, you all know that one is very emphatic, this is very emphatic. Man, what does that mean? Well, let me tell you something. There are 7 different views of this. Some have said that an elder only gets one wife, and if that wife dies, that's all he gets. Can I tell you a real true story? I won't mention any names, this is a true story. There was a very famous dispensational evangelical preacher. If I mentioned the name, you'd know it immediately, who believed this, that one man husband, one wife husband was so emphatic that here is what he taught seminary students. He said, this means that you get one wife and one wife only. If your wife dies, you cannot remarry. For years, he taught that to seminary students. That if you did get remarried, you violated your qualifications as an elder. Unfortunately, his wife died. And then his theology really got practically relevant to his own circumstances. And he had a problem because 3 years after his wife died, he and this lady had an attraction to each other. And he had a problem. He had always taught seminary students, one wife kind of guy. You get one. She died. That's it. But now he's in love with this other woman. His wife's dead. What does he do? Do you know what his solution was? He said this, and this is what kills me. Call me pastor, not elder. And he married the woman. Now, can you imagine all the seminary students that told their congregation over those years, if you're an elder and your wife dies, that's all you get. How many of them remain single? Probably. But this guy, when it came to him, said, well, that's an elder. Call me pastor. I'll marry her, but I won't be an elder. I'm not saying that's a good solution. I'm saying that's what he did, and he married the woman. Guys, be very careful not to paint yourself into a corner theologically on some issues where here it's very emphatic, isn't it? One wife, husband. Well, clearly we see in Romans 7, Paul says if the wife, husband dies, she's free to marry it. So I doubt in the tenor of Scripture that's what it is. Others say it means no divorce. That the person has never been divorced. But then we have the problem of Jesus allowing except for the cause of adultery. So what if the elder's wife, that can happen. Then others say, well, he's a one-wife kind of guy, where it means he's not a womanizer. I've met men that are like that. Haven't you? So, solve this for me. We clearly see that it's very emphatic. It's placed forward. Here's word order. I'm observing. So what do you think? 7 major views, 6 or 7 major views on what this means. Anybody want to solve this for me? Clearly, Paul's being emphatic. One wife, husband. So here's what I'm saying. You have to be careful, precision versus accuracy. You don't want to make that say more. I think that that famous dispensational preacher pressed the meaning of that to the point where that's not what maybe Paul intended. Think of all those precious seminary guys' wife died, they stayed single because that's what their professor taught them. But when it came to that professor, I found an exception clause for me. Can't preach that. So what do you think? What's your solution here?
His wife dies, he has no wife. If he remarries, he's a one wife.
Some think then it's polygamy, that an elder can't have more than one wife. I mean, doesn't Paul say in 1 Timothy, a man has to control his home well if he can't control his own home? Can you imagine what it would be like? Do you know what the children of Israel remembered when they made the Mosaic legislation? They remembered their history of how the 4 wives of Jacob fought and had all sorts of tension. And so can you imagine the tension if you had multiple wives? The kids fighting, the problems. Some think that it's talking about polygamy. Some will say, well, they didn't practice polygamy in that day. Well, but could Paul be saying, don't have 2 wives as an elder? You get 1 wife. Well, you guys are really coming up with some solutions here, you know?
I wonder if the problems they were facing within that culture would cause them to write that. I'm not sure the background.
Not enough information to know, but it's possible. Some throw out polygamy. They say, well, the Jews didn't practice polygamy in that day, or it wasn't. But nonetheless, 1 wife would mean not multiple wives, at least. I don't know. I'm just thinking. I'm teaching to observe and to reason and to think. He's being very emphatic. There are some that would take this as 1 wife at a time. So there could be an elder who is divorced biblically. I mean, I've been at places where they want to know, what do you think about a divorced elder? Where they'll ask you these questions. And you have to make a decision. And there are different views on divorce. One is divorce under the grounds of adultery. Some see 1 Corinthians 7 on the basis of desertion. Tronway, were you going to say something?
Well, I actually just had a question for Gune. Is that always wife? It means woman? In what context? I mean, how strong of that is that to say? Could you say 1 woman? So it's not just.
Well, it would
wife,
depend upon the context, but clearly here it's the idea of marriage. I think that's pretty clear.
You think that's just your opinion, and you've taught us to. I'm just teasing.
Thank you for recognizing that. So you are welcome to come at me and what other meaning could it have?
Could it be more general, just woman? And
A
how they-
1 woman kind of guy? I don't get it. So only have 1 daughter, I have 3. Have I violated that one? I mean, I don't know. If you interrogate, and I don't mind you doing that, Drawing. That's what I like, is a little bit of, you need to question. But what does Paul mean by 1 woman man. That's why some people take it's the kind of guy he is. There are a lot of men that seem to be womanizers. And that can, I've heard this story, I don't know how many times. The preacher kissing the church secretary, the preacher doing this or that, the elder doing this or that. So that's why some people take it means you're a one-woman kind of guy. You're not always trying to step up to a new situation with another woman. There are men like this. Michael?
That seems to fit best just in the context of the qualifications Paul's giving, because
Which one seems to, Michael?
the one that you just said, that's the kind of person that he is. He's dedicated to one woman, to his wife. Because he's giving a list of characteristics.
What if he's not married?
Huh?
What if he's not married?
Well, if he's not married, this wouldn't apply. Clearly, Timothy was not married. But if he is, and then I've had people say this, that the elder has to be married. That's another view. That the elder has to be married. And yet that conflicts with Paul saying, I wish that some of you were like me, not attached to a woman. And I've had churches get up and say, we don't want him because he's not married. I do think it's better if you have a pastor per se that's married, because then he understands family issues and he understands when a wife beats her husband, that why he so deserves that so richly. But that's another view, Scott, that he has to be married.
I mean, if Jesus doesn't qualify to be an elder in your church, you might need to review that.
Well, didn't the Da Vinci Code say something about Mary Magdalene? You know, little joke there.
Authority.
Huh?
Appeal to authority.
Yeah, nod in.
I think before that they saying let he be faithful in all things. So this could be faithfulness to his wife.
Well, here's another circumstance. My wife has an aunt who was a nurse in Niger for 50 years. She just retired. She's in her 80s now. Matter of fact, Niger was her home. And when the church moved into Niger and people became Christians, there was a real problem in Niger because when these people became saved, most of them had polygamous circumstances, multiple wives. So they were trying to figure out, what do we do? If we have these men divorce every wife but one, then these women are without support. So there can be some real interesting, difficult cultural situations here. So you, like Michael, you're a one-woman kind of guy. You love your wife. You're dedicated to her, kind of an idea. So that necessarily for you isn't looking at divorce. It's more looking at whatever wife you're with, you're dedicated to her at the time. Anybody else?
Question. This idea of interpreting it as a one-woman kind of guy, could that be kind of a sort of anachronism? Because the idea of a one-woman man, it makes sense in our culture. We understand what that means. But in those times, to be a one-woman man basically means to have a wife, because there's no concept of like having a woman other than your wife.
Well, European culture, how many of you are from Europe? I understand in Europe, isn't there the culture where you're married to your wife, but sometimes there's a woman on the side? Is this not, am I stereotypically...
Especially like 50 years ago when the Catholic Church did not allow you to get divorced, you would have a woman on the side. So the old men have all had a mistress except
So what they did was didn't divorce their wife, but they,
you can't divorce against the law. So
yeah.
and you can't
Is it
kill
still in Italy, divorce is against the law?
What's that?
Is it still against the law in Italy?
No, you can get divorced. But that was especially like the movie Divorce Italian Style. That's depicts that.
I didn't see it.
This guy imagines ways to kill his wife because he wants to.
And it's because of that strict, they can't divorce law kind of thing. Well, so far you guys have given me theories, but no one settled this for me. What do you think? This is where you're observing the text and you're meditating.
Maybe this was textually added in to.
Nice try. Well, it clearly means that you shouldn't have multiple wives. I think that's clear, right? But if you can narrow it, does it mean that an elder can't be divorced? And I've been in churches where I've gone into candidate and they've said, we've got an elder on our board that was divorced. What do you think? While they were a Christian. And they've asked what you think, and this is where you have to decide on this kind of a verse too. These are all, unfortunately, divorce is very frequent now. Back at the turn of the 1900s, divorce was something that was not frequent, and it was considered a cultural shame. Today, divorce is just very rampant, and a lot of people don't even believe in marriage, let alone the divorce. So you guys have to figure out how you're going to approach this with that. This is a very difficult problem. Look at all the different solutions you've come up with. And yet we know Paul is being very emphatic. One wife, man. Just don't do what that one famous dispensational preacher did and say, the rule is for you, but not for me. I make up the rule for you, but I don't follow the rule myself. I found an exception and married the woman, which I'm glad he found somebody. But I just think of all the damage he did to other seminary students who stayed single, believing the professor and the interpretation that he held to. Jordan?
With the fact that every qualification, it really is subjective, where you kind of have to look at the person and see their life and decide whether they qualify or not. Wouldn't that one have to do with also trying to see their life and seeing if they qualify in that aspect? Can you make that statement? You know what I mean? Can I say that, like what Mike was saying, that it has to be that the man is not a womanizer, because all the other ones are very, all the other qualifications are based on character. There's a better word, character. You see what I'm saying? But that would be the only one, in my opinion, maybe drunkenness, but that would be the only one where somebody isn't making an evaluation of somebody.
All I know is that you take a commentary on the pastorals and you take good men that are in ministry, and you will see quite a division on the interpretation of this verse. This is why I caution that when you preach, be very careful not to become overbearing on when a passage is controversial and answers don't come readily. I think you should be careful, humble, and contemplative rather than becoming so hard and fast. Here is where, after I started looking at this, understanding the construction, I can see why there's been 7 different interpretations, and that's why I go here, because this is one of them where I think a humble approach, I think a respect and a humble approach, respecting different opinions, and Lord help me, because we all want to obey God's word, don't we? The difficulty is sometimes that answers don't just readily jump out at times. So that means you need to be a little humble and try to understand different views here. And it just means that it's a prayerful, careful consideration on this. And if it is controversially hard, try to not be so, you know what I mean? And the first thing that you should do when you form an opinion is apply that opinion to yourself. See, you're not preaching for others to listen to your rules. You've got to actually comply with your own preaching. There's a lot of preachers that get into this idea the rules are for them, not for me. You know that? The rules are for the group, but not for me. I'm above the rules. I tell these people the rules, but I don't. And that's what happened with that preacher. He may have believed it until his wife died, but then the rules were not for him. So be careful. You're observing the text. When the plain sense of Scripture is clear, you can be clear. When there's a problem in the text that requires research, please be careful how you approach it. Good men that love the Lord, that believe in His inerrant word, will at times disagree. Can you live with that? Huh? But remember, when you make the rule, if you believe this means you only get one wife and no others, and if your wife dies, out of luck, Charlie, and then you preach that, and then your wife, may God forbid, dies, and you violate your rule and marry another woman, you know what that's called? Thank you. Yet he was a wonderful preacher and a very great theologian.
Does he still camp out on that?
He's passed away. That'll give you another hint as to who this was.
Well, did he camp out on it after he got married again?
I don't know. To me, I think he would have taken a lot of heat, especially from seminary students who said, you taught us and now you found an exception. But I'll tell you something, guys, loneliness, men were not built to be alone. Women, in my congregation, I have a significant number of widows. It seems like for the women, one man trying to deal with him was enough. But a guy, you know, they had to deal with him all their life. That's it, man. Most widows, it's very rare that women, widows, will marry again. But men aren't built, in general speaking terms, to be alone. Now there are some, and he got lonely. And I sympathize, a heartfelt sympathy for the fact that his wife died and he was lonely. And I would think nothing of him being remarried. What I don't like, and I want to warn you on, is that he made up a rule for everybody and then did not comply with his rule. Gentlemen, when you preach, the first one that the rules apply to is you. Jason?
Isn't there a danger, though, that you gotta respect that at least he was staying true to what he thought the text believed? Granted, he didn't follow it, so he exposes himself as a hypocrite. But if he tried to, on the front end, preach a principle that he knows he can conform to? Isn't there a danger in your manipulating the text because you want to make it easy for you to follow?
Well, what caused him to change his view of the text? You can't have that. You got to think. That means you've got to be wise in what you preach. Understand the ramifications of where, listen to me, you need to understand the ramifications of where you're leading your people. I know preachers, let me get you this, that would teach no grounds for divorce whatsoever. And then they ended up divorced. I could tell you a very famous and unfortunately in churches today, divorce is rampant. I do believe there are biblical grounds for divorce. I try to counsel people don't. Try to reconcile. But there are biblical grounds for divorce, such as adultery. Jordan?
You didn't answer my question.
I tried deliberately not to do those kind of things. Gets me into trouble.
Well, how would you preach that?
What?
This. What would you say?
I would delineate some of the major views, say what I think, but realize that in this it's controversial. And what?
What do you think?
What? Oh, what do I think
Yeah, tell us.
on this view?
Yeah.
Thank you all for today. And we will see you Thursday before your spring break. I hope that answered your question, Jordan. I've tried to be as clear as I could be.